Welcome to the deep dive. Today, our mission is really to pull apart the recent Nobel Prize announcements, the ones from October 2025. We're not just here to sort of, applaud the winners. We want to use these prizes as a lens, a really specific lens, actually,
Right.
to look at the huge scientific systems and, frankly, the pretty complex geopolitical rivalries bubbling away under the surface there in East Asia.
Yeah, absolutely. It's fundamentally about how this global recognition, these prizes, they get tangled up with national strength, national pride, especially between Japan and its neighbor, China.
That's the core tension, isn't it?
It really is, and that's what we need to analyze. We've got, well, a pretty complex stack of sources here. Everything from, believe it or not, bookie odds on the Literature Prize
That's fascinating.
to R&D spending stats, deep dives into Japanese industrial policy from decades ago, and then contrasting all that with China's institutional drive for legitimacy on the world stage.
So the goal is to get beyond the headlines.
Exactly. To really synthesize why a specific scientific breakthrough, say in Osaka or Kyoto, triggers such a unique, almost calculated political reaction over in Beijing. It's about connecting the dots.
And the news itself gives us the perfect way in. Japan scoring this big double victory in the science categories this year. It really puts a spotlight on their research model, doesn't it? The one that seems to reward incredible patience.
Patience and perhaps a tolerance for failure we'll get into.
Yeah, and at the same time, you had all that high-profile speculation, the betting odds around authors from both Japan and China for the Literature Prize.
Right.
So it's this moment of intense national pride, but it also throws these disparities in foundational scientific success right into sharp relief, especially in that region. Okay, let's unpack this double win for Japan then, starting with the Physiology or Medicine Prize. This feels like a really fundamental one. It went partly to Simon Sakaguchi, who's a distinguished professor at Osaka University. What was the breakthrough here? What exactly did he discover?
Well, the prize recognized his discovery of these very specialized immune cells. They're called regulatory T cells, or T-regs for short.
Regs. Okay.
Now, to really grasp how big a deal this was, you have to understand the scientific thinking before Sakaguchi. For decades, immunologists, they pretty much believed the immune system achieved what's called immune tolerance.
Which is basically not attacking your own body.
Exactly. Recognizing self from non-self. The belief was this tolerance happened only through subtraction, like a process of elimination.
Peace through preemptive strikes, almost.
Oh,
If a T cell looked too aggressive back in the thymus, where they develop, it was just destroyed, gone before it could cause any autoimmune problem.
Precisely. That was the dogma. That was the established wisdom. Sakaguchi's work, and this is key, it started way back. We're talking the 1980s, the 90s. His really foundational paper came out in 1995.
Wow, okay. So a long time coming.
A very long time. And his work, it represented a complete paradigm shift. His aha moment was proving that immune tolerance isn't just passive deletion. It's an active process. It's managed. And it's managed by these T-regs.
So they're not just sitting back. They're actively involved.
Actively suppressing immune responses. They sort of patrol the body and basically tell any rogue T cells that might be attacking the body's own tissues to stand down, to calm down.
So he found the immune systems, like chief peace negotiator or something. And the real-world impact, thinking about autoimmune diseases, must be huge.
Oh, absolutely massive. Because when T-regs fail or don't work properly, that's when you get these devastating conditions. Things like type 1 diabetes, rheumatoid arthritis, multiple sclerosis. Sakaguchi essentially identified the very mechanism that actively prevents your body from turning on itself.
Incredible.
And what's really critical for our discussion today, thinking about research systems, is that his work initially was met with a lot of skepticism. Deep skepticism, actually.
Well, why?
Because it flew in the face of decades of established thinking. People were heavily invested in the old model, which, speaks volumes about the kind of research culture that must exist to allow someone like him to endure that skepticism, to keep pushing, and ultimately prove his concept was right.
So how did the scientific community finally come around? What tipped the balance?
The final piece of the puzzle was identifying a specific marker. That skepticism really only got overcome later with work by others, notably Brunkow and Ramsdell. They identified a specific protein marker for these T-regs. It's called FOXP3.
FOXP3.
Okay. And once they had that marker, well, then scientists could reliably isolate T-regs. They could study their function definitively, experimentally, and they could start exploring, therapeutic applications. That discovery really confirmed the importance of Sakaguchi's decades-long hypothesis, and it fundamentally changed how we approach immunology today.
A true long game paying off.
Uh,
Okay, now for the second science win. The Chemistry Prize. Co-awarded to Susumu Kitagawa of Kyoto University. This sounds quite different, more like molecular construction. The award was for developing metal-organic frameworks, or MOFs.
Yeah, MOFs. This is it's high-level synthetic chemistry. Some people describe it as molecular Lego, which is kind of a neat analogy.
Molecular Lego, I like that.
But it's Lego for building things that solve real-world environmental problems. Essentially, the laureates designed completely new types of materials. They used metal ions as these sort of rigid, predictable cornerstones,
Okay.
and then linked them together using long, organic, carbon-based molecules as the struts or linkers. And the result is this crystalline material. It's highly porous, but the pores, the cavities inside, are incredibly well organized and uniform in size.
So we're talking about building microscopic sponges or sieves, but with absolute precision, right? What makes these cavities different from, say, activated charcoal, which is also porous?
That's a great question. Traditional porous materials like charcoal, they're often amorphous, kind of messy internally. The architecture isn't predictable. MOFs, though, are different. They are crystalline, ordered. You can actually design the shape and the size of those pores with incredible precision.
You can tailor them.
You can tailor them, which means you can engineer them to capture very specific molecules or specific gases, and only those molecules while letting others pass through. It's like targeted absorption, but happening at the nanoscale.
Wow. And just like the T-regs story, this wasn't some overnight flash of genius either, was it? The award recognized a huge effort over time.
Absolutely. A marathon, not a sprint. Richard Robson, one of the co-laureates from Australia, he actually proposed the theoretical structure way back in 1989.
89.
Yeah. Then the Japanese contribution from Kitagawa, he was the one who first successfully made a MOF that was genuinely porous and could actually absorb gas back in 1997. And then Omar Yagi, the third co-laureate from the US, he completed the synthesis of really stable, robust frameworks like the famous MOF5 in the early 2000s.
So a truly international long-term collaboration.
Exactly. And Kitagawa himself, when he got the news, he emphasized that he was honored to have his long-standing research recognized. That phrase, long-standing research, I think it's going to echo through our whole analysis of the Japanese system.
It definitely seems like a theme.
Yeah.
And the potential uses mentioned in our sources, they're not just academic curiosities, are they? They sound like potential answers to huge global problems.
That's the key takeaway. Because
Yeah.
you can customize that internal geometry, MOFs have just enormous potential, really, to tackle critical global challenges. The sources highlight several big ones.
Like what?
Okay, so harvesting water, drinkable water, straight out of desert air. Imagine the implications of that.
Game-changing.
Completely. They can selectively capture CO2, carbon dioxide from industrial emissions like power plants. They're also looking really promising for advanced separation tasks like pulling out those nasty forever chemicals, PFAS, from contaminated water supplies. And even recovering valuable rare earth elements, which are vital for electronics, from industrial waste streams. So yeah, this is fundamental chemistry delivering tangible solutions for infrastructure, climate change, resource scarcity, major global issues.
Okay, now just to set the stage a bit more for the geopolitical angle, let's quickly touch on the literature Nobel speculation, because the announcement for that prize, the 11 million Swedish kroner, was due right around the same time as these science wins.
Right, and this is where the cultural, sometimes nationalistic tensions often play out most visibly. You know, it gets reduced almost to a horse race, with bookmakers setting odds.
Yeah.
This year, the Chinese author Can Zhu, her real name is Deng Xiaohua, she's known for a very experimental, avant-garde style. She was actually the joint favorite, according to the odds, 101.
Okay, a serious contender.
Very serious.
Yeah.
She's got the literary chop. She was longlisted for the International Booker Prize back in 2019. And if she had won, she would have been only the third Chinese-born laureate ever, after Mo Yan in 2012 and Gao Xingjian back in 2000.
And then, almost inevitably, the perennial Japanese favorite, Haruki Murakami, age 76 now. He was third in the running, right?
Yep, Murakami at 141 odds. It's become this sort of annual ritual, hasn't it? This highly public anticipation of, will this finally be Murakami's year? The national expectation in Japan is palpable every October.
It really is.
And it's worth noting, too, this intense focus on the Literature Prize comes right after the previous year's winner was the South Korean author Han Kang, for the Vegetarian and Human X.
Right, another East Asian win.
Exactly. So East Asia pays very close attention to these cultural prizes, there's no doubt. But I think the really crucial point for our discussion is that the concrete, measurable, double victory in the science categories for Japan this year, well, that's undeniable. It gives Japan tangible proof, you could say, of systemic scientific strength. And that kind of overshadows any speculation about who might win the arguably more subjective cultural prize.
Okay, so that brings us right to the core of the analysis. This double victory isn't just a fluke, is it? It builds on a long history of Japanese Nobel success, particularly in the sciences. So, what is the engine behind Japan's scientific system? How does it manage to sustain this kind of decades-long research, like the work on T-regs and MOFs, especially when, presumably, the initial investment has no guarantee of a quick commercial payoff?
Well, according to researchers within Japan and also observers looking in from neighboring countries like South Korea, the secret seems to lie in the research philosophy itself. It's described as a system that fundamentally embraces failure.
Embraces failure. How so?
It means it gives researchers the institutional space, the time, and maybe the cultural permission to endure failure over very long periods, sometimes decades. You simply cannot produce a breakthrough like the T-reg discovery, which, remember, faced years and years of deep skepticism.
Right.
Or the MOF realization, which took, 18 years from the initial concept to a working porous structure. You can't do that without a system that has sort of institutionalized patience built into its structure.
That seems almost counterintuitive, doesn't it? Especially if we look back at Japan's historical R&D strategy, say, in the post-war decades. Didn't Japan's initial big push focus heavily on the practical, the commercial, more of a catch-up strategy?
It absolutely did. You're spot on. If you rewind to the 1960s and 70s, Japan's R&D strategy was highly targeted, very strategic. The focus was squarely on what they called knowledge-intensive areas, things they saw as essential for global competition.
Okay.
Computers, fine chemicals, nuclear energy, semiconductors. The main goal was rapid industrial growth, becoming a technological powerhouse. And that required massive R&D spending, yes, but directed mostly towards things that promised relatively quick, measurable technological gains.
And how was that spending structured? You mentioned the funding kind of reflected this industrial bias.
Yeah, the bias was pretty stark, actually. Our sources say around 2/3, maybe even more, of all R&D spending was concentrated directly in the corporate industrial sector.
2/3 in industry.
Right. Which meant that basic research, the kind of fundamental curiosity-driven science that typically happens in universities and often leads to Nobel Prizes down the line, that was, historically anyway, poorly funded in Japan, certainly compared to, say, the US or major European countries at the time.
Okay, but that raises a really critical question then. If basic university research was generally underfunded, how did long-term, high-risk projects like the groundwork for T-regs or MOFs even survive for 20 or 30 years before proving their worth?
That's where the nuance comes in. And it's where the Japanese government played a really decisive, though maybe not always obvious role. They used powerful, often non-legislative tools. The most famous is probably administrative guidance.
Administrative guidance, that sounds subtle.
It was. It wasn't law, exactly. It was more like strong suggestions, influential direction coming from powerful government ministries. Think of the legendary Ministry of International Trade and Industry, MIT. They would guide both industry and the elite universities towards specific, high-risk but potentially high-return areas they deemed nationally important.
So even if the overall pot for university basic science was small.
Exactly. Key national projects, especially those seen as having long-term technological or strategic potential, they were often protected. They received sufficient sustained funding channeled specifically to them. The government definitely favored technology with strong commercial potential, as the sources say, but they sometimes defined potential quite broadly. Broadly enough to include decades-long foundational research if it promised a strategic advantage down the road.
So the government was acting a bit like a strategic national venture capitalist, picking and nurturing specific long-term bets, moving Japan from just being a technology importer to becoming a true innovator.
That's a great way to put it, a strategic venture capitalist. Because remember, in the early post-war years, Japan was a massive technology importer, highly systematic, very efficient about it. Our sources state almost 60% of the technology they imported came from the U.S.
Wow.
And crucially, Japanese companies, often with government backing or guidance, managed to secure these licenses for really low royalties, sometimes less than 5% of sales. It was like a huge, coordinated, nationwide exercise in knowledge transfer.
So when did that start to change? When did Japan pivot from just absorbing knowledge to creating its own cutting-edge tech?
The big shift seems to have happened around the late 1960s, specifically post-1968, according to our sources. Japan wasn't just taking in technical assistance anymore. They moved towards pure patent licensing and increasingly towards aggressive cross-licensing deals where they had technology to offer in return.
Ah, so they were building their own intellectual property.
Exactly. All that accumulated knowledge and practical experience started to mature into real indigenous capability. And it happened relatively quickly. By the early 1970s, the technological gap in many areas had shrunk so dramatically that the patent balanced the flow of royalties for technology between the US and Japan had been, as one source puts it, all but eliminated. Japan was becoming a net exporter of technology in several key fields.
Okay, let's make this more concrete. Can we point to some specific historical examples of Japanese innovation that came out of this system, things that really showcase this long-term investment paying off, even before the recent Nobels for T-regs and MOFs?
Sure, there are some great examples. Take industrial microbiology, for instance. Japan became, and arguably still is, a world leader in fermentation technologies.
Fermentation, like for soy sauce.
Well, yes, but much more advanced, too. They produce something like 90% of the world's lysine, which is a vital amino acid used in animal feed. Big business. They also pioneered industrial microbiology more broadly, making landmark discoveries. For example, the anti-tumor antibiotic sarcomycin, it was discovered in Japan and was so specialized that for a long time it was only produced in Japan. That shows real foundational strength in biotech, even back then.
Okay, so biotech. What about material science? That
Nice.
seems like a precursor to something like MOFs.
Absolutely crucial area for them. They really excelled in developing specialized high-performance materials. They developed and then licensed out this high-permeability, grain-oriented silicon steel brand name, Orient Core High-B, essential stuff for making large, efficient electrical transformers.
Right.
And perhaps most famously, they invented Toryca carbon fiber. This was a completely in-house invention by the company Toray. They figured out how to make this incredibly strong, lightweight material by firing polyacrylonitrile filament.
Carbon fiber, yeah, that's everywhere now.
Exactly. But back then, it was revolutionary. It was so advanced and strategically important that the U.S. Department of Defense wanted to buy it for military aircraft. It also turned out to be relevant for making high-speed centrifuges for uranium enrichment, which shows a level of material science capability that other countries simply couldn't license or easily replicate at the time.
And developing something like Toryca must have required massive, sustained R&D investment, probably with no immediate return guaranteed.
Absolutely. It really speaks to that national commitment, that long-term vision guided by ministries like MIT. And one final example. Think about the really large-scale, long-term national projects like fusion energy research.
Fusion, okay.
Ambitious, hugely ambitious. The Japan Atomic Energy Research Institute had a project called the JFT2 tokamak. Back in the day, it achieved what was then the world's best plasma confinement time, 25 milliseconds at 7 million degrees Celsius. That might not sound like much now, but it was world-leading then. These kinds of massive projects, requiring decades of funding, government protection, and industrial discipline, they built the deep infrastructure, the expertise, the culture of long-term R&D that ultimately allows researchers like Sakaguchi or Kitagawa the intellectual space and the time they need to pursue curiosity-driven science that, decades later, wins Nobel Prizes. So paradoxically, maybe, that initial historical focus on commercial technology helped build the stable foundation needed for basic research to eventually flourish alongside it.
Okay, now let's pivot. We need to shift focus to Japan's neighbor, China, and the institutional forces really driving things there. Given Japan's continued success, the string of Nobels, we really have to analyze why China seems to have such, well, complicated and intense feelings about achieving its own Nobel-level recognition.
Yeah, the complexity, it really stems directly from the ruling party's needs, the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP. Their legitimacy, in their own eyes, and how they project it, relies heavily on achievement.
Achievement in what sense?
Historically, the big achievement was unifying the country in 1949 after decades of war and chaos. Then, more recently, especially after the reforms started in the late 1970s, it's been about delivering unprecedented breakneck GDP growth, lifting hundreds of millions out of poverty.
Right, the economic miracle narrative.
Exactly. But there's another layer here, a much deeper historical driver, especially when it comes to science and technology. It's tied directly to national humiliation.
You mean going back to the Opium Wars?
Precisely. Since that devastating defeat to Western powers in the First Opium War back in 1840, pretty much every Chinese regime since then has explicitly linked its own legitimacy to catching up technologically, closing the gap with the West, and really critically for this discussion, closing the gap with its regional rival, Japan.
And the war with Japan in the 20th century must have amplified that massively.
Hugely. The incredibly painful experience of resisting the Japanese invasion from 1931 to 1945 deeply ingrained this sense of needing technological parity or even superiority for national survival and dignity. Initially, after 1949, that tech focus was almost purely military, developing the atomic bomb, ICBMs, demonstrating hard power.
But now the focus has shifted.
It's shifted significantly. Today, the main measure of national strength, the main arena for competition, is seen as economic competitiveness and overall technological sophistication, which means success in non-defense R&D is crucial. And Nobel Prizes, especially in the sciences, are seen as the ultimate validation of that. They're viewed as tangible proof of global, non-military scientific leadership.
And China has definitely put its money where its mouth is on this. The sheer scale of the investment in R&D is just staggering.
It is genuinely unprecedented in history, I think. Look at the numbers. China's R&D spending as a percentage of GDP, it went from less than 0.6% back in 1982 to nearly 2% by 2013. That's an annual growth rate of something like 18% every year since 2000.
Incredible growth.
It is. Our sources were projecting China was on track to actually overtake the U.S. in total R&D spending sometime around 2022. And it's not just money. They've systematically built the world's largest pool of scientists and engineers. They've put huge effort into luring back top talent, Chinese researchers who studied or worked abroad, often with very lucrative state-backed recruitment packages. Millions of dollars in some cases.
Okay, so they clearly have the resources. They have the manpower. They have the political will, the national drive. And yet, the kind of truly foundational scientific breakthroughs that Japan keeps producing, they still seem largely elusive for China, don't they? Which points to some kind of institutional paradox, maybe, a fundamental conflict within the Chinese system itself.
That is the absolute crux of the issue. That's the ultimate tension we need to understand. Because Nobel-level science, the kind that wins physiology or chemistry prizes, it's almost always driven by open, critical, curiosity-based inquiry. It requires questioning the existing assumptions, the dogma, just like Sakaguchi did with immune tolerance.
Right. You need that freedom to challenge things.
You absolutely do. And that fundamental need for academic freedom, for open debate, for pursuing unexpected avenues, it clashes directly, head-on, with the CCP's absolute imperative to maintain tight political control and ensure ideological loyalty throughout society, including, maybe especially, in universities.
So the state's top-down quest for Nobels is actually undermining the conditions needed to win Nobels.
Paradoxically, yes. As one source puts it, the quest itself is seen as antithetical to the principle that creativity and innovation in scientific research must be driven by the curiosity of the scientist. You can't easily command foundational breakthroughs into existence.
We should probably dig into the specifics here. What are the actual institutional mechanisms the CCP uses to enforce this control within universities? And how does that create a kind of chilling effect that might stifle the intellectual risk-taking needed for a Nobel?
The control mechanisms are pervasive, and they operate at multiple levels. Take something like...
What was it?
It was reportedly an internal directive circulated among CCP officials, and it allegedly explicitly banned the promotion of certain Western ideas in universities. Things like constitutional democracy, universal values, press freedom, and also questioning the party's official historical narratives, what they call historical nihilism.
So right off the bat, that tells academics certain topics, certain lines of inquiry are politically dangerous, off-limits.
Exactly. It immediately narrows the scope for critical thinking and open discussion, which are vital not just for the social sciences and humanities, but can also impact the broader intellectual climate needed for scientific creativity, too.
And how is this enforced? Is it just suggestion or?
Oh, it's institutionalized. There are regular political inspections of universities. After one such round of inspections, our sources mention 14 elite universities were publicly criticized for ideological weakness. That sends a very strong signal.
A warning shot.
Definitely. And to enforce loyalty more directly, some universities have actually set up dedicated teachers' affairs departments. These aren't about pedagogy or HR in the normal sense. They are placed directly under the university's party committee.
The party committee.
And their explicit job is ideological and political work. essentially monitoring, assessing, and managing the political thinking and reliability of the academic staff.
Wow. So it creates this environment where professors must be constantly looking over their shoulder, aware that their professional work and their perceived political loyalty are being judged together.
That's the effect. And the examples of what happens when someone crosses the line, they really underscore the risks. We have the case of an economics professor, Yu Shengdong. He was reportedly fired after some of his students reported comments he made in class as being politically inappropriate.
Fired based on student reports.
Yes. The system effectively incentivizes students to act as political monitors for the party, which you can imagine fundamentally erodes the trust you need for open intellectual exploration in a classroom.
Absolutely.
Yeah, any other examples?
There's another case mentioned, an associate professor named Tang Yun. She was demoted and punished for comments made outside China that were deemed injurious to the country's reputation. And the impact isn't just punishment, it's also proactive self-censorship. One scholar, who was critical of the Cultural Revolution in his historical work, reportedly had to cut over 20,000 Chinese characters from his book manuscript just to get approval for it to be published on the mainland.
20,000 characters. That's significant censorship.
It's huge. It shows the pressure to conform, to toe the party line, even in academic research.
And this reach, this political mandate, it doesn't stop at China's borders either, does it? Our sources suggest it actively affects international scientific collaboration.
That's right. It extends overseas. There are documented reports of Chinese students studying abroad, facing monitoring, even intimidation. Some students have reported being interrogated when they return home for visits, questioned at the airport about their friends and activities abroad.
Yes, and even, in some cases, allegedly being asked to provide information on, effectively spy on, their professors or fellow students at Western universities. This kind of intrusion, this expectation that loyalty to the party overrides academic or personal relationships, it fundamentally undermines the open, trust-based international exchange of ideas that's so essential for cutting-edge collaborative research today.
Okay, so given all these internal pressures and controls, how does China's official apparatus, the media, the foreign ministry, how do they react publicly when a rival like Japan does achieve a major, globally recognized success, like this year's Science Nobels?
Well, the reaction is often quite revealing. It's frequently characterized by either intentional downplaying, strategic silence, or sometimes carefully chosen ambivalence. A good example is the reaction, or lack thereof, to this year's Nobel Peace Prize winner, Hidankyu, the Japanese anti-nuclear weapons group.
Okay, what happened there?
When the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson Mao Ning was directly asked about it at a press conference, she very deliberately avoided commenting on Hidankyu or their achievement. She just merely said, according to the report, that China believes in the complete prohibition and thorough destruction of nuclear weapons. A generic statement.
Sidestepping the specific award to a Japanese group.
Exactly. And then, tellingly, she added that the Chinese media choose for themselves what to report, which is widely understood as diplomatic code for, we are not going to report this widely, or we're going to minimize it.
So it seems they're happy to celebrate the hard science wins they aspire to replicate, but they actively suppress or ignore achievements related to universal values, peace, or political freedoms that might challenge the CCP's control model.
That seems to be the pattern. Even the official reaction to Mo Yan winning the Literature Nobel back in 2012, while it was certainly a moment of national pride, it was described as being noticeably toned down compared to the intense, state-driven pursuit of the science prizes. They appear to want the measurable prestige, the global validation that comes with a Nobel, but without importing the potentially dangerous ideas or the political risks associated with genuine intellectual independence or critiques of power. And Japan's continued success, especially in science, just seems to compound the internal pressure and perhaps the frustration within China to deliver comparable breakthroughs, but ones that are politically palatable.
And this friction, this complex reaction, it's obviously playing out against the backdrop of much deeper, almost visceral, historical and geopolitical tension between the two countries. Right. Which probably explains why China's feelings about Japan's success are so particularly acute.
Absolutely. The general public sentiment on both sides creates a really charged atmosphere for any kind of perceived national win by the other. The polling data we have is, frankly, quite sobering.
How so?
Well, one poll showed only 11% of Japanese people expressed a favorable view of China. And going the other way, only 14% of Chinese voiced a favorable opinion of Japan. Those are
Really stark mutual dislike.
Yeah.
And a lot of that is weighted by history, isn't it?
Hugely weighted by history, particularly the unresolved issues around World War II and how it's remembered, or rather, how each side feels the other remembers it.
The apology issue.
Exactly. The disagreement over wartime apologies remains this major stumbling block. Our sources cite a poll where 77%, more than three-quarters of Chinese people, believe Japan has not adequately expressed regret for its military actions back in the 1930s and 40s.
77%.
Yeah. But conversely, a majority of Japanese people, 53%, believe their country has apologized sufficiently. That enormous gap, that 43-point difference in perception about historical responsibility, it creates this almost unbridgeable chasm. It ensures that Japan's achievements today, like the Nobels, are almost never viewed in China purely as neutral scientific progress. They inevitably get interpreted through the lens of ongoing national rivalry and perceived historical grievance.
And this deep-seated mistrust then spills over into contemporary fears about actual conflict.
It absolutely does. That historical friction feeds directly into present-day anxieties. There's significant concern reported in both countries that the ongoing territorial disputes, particularly over those islands, the Senkaku in Japan, Diaoyu in China, could actually escalate into a real military conflict.
How high is that concern?
The numbers are high. 80% of Japanese surveyed expressed that fear, and 59% of Chinese did too. So you have this atmosphere thick with historical mistrust, competing narratives, and genuine fear of future conflict. In that context, Japan demonstrating continued scientific dominance, as symbolized by the Nobels, is inevitably going to be interpreted by Beijing through a very sharp lens of national rivalry and strategic competition. So if we try to, tie this all together, the 2025 Nobel Prizes really do serve as this excellent, almost diagnostic tool. They throw into sharp relief the fundamental contrast between these two major East Asian systems. You have Japan's system, which, it started out very pragmatic, very industrially focused in the post-war era, but it seems to have matured or perhaps inadvertently created the conditions for a research culture that now reaps the rewards of incredibly patient, failure-embracing fundamental scientific inquiry, the kind that leads to T-regs and MOFs.
Well, on the other side, you have China. They've successfully channeled truly unprecedented levels of wealth and manpower into R&D, a massive state-directed effort aimed squarely at buying scientific legitimacy, boosting national prestige, and underpinning the CCP's own claims to leadership.
Right, but they still seem to be grappling with, maybe even actively suppressing, the one crucial element that seems necessary for those truly foundational Nobel-level breakthroughs: genuine intellectual freedom. That political imperative, the absolute need to maintain party control over universities and intellectual life, it seems to act as this fundamental systemic brake on the kind of open-ended curiosity and intellectual risk-taking that science at the highest level demands.
So it sets up this enduring tension, this geopolitical dynamic. China has the resources, the scale, the national will to catch up technologically. No doubt about that.
Not at all.
But the very political system that enforces the ideological conformity and stinkability the party demands might simultaneously be stifling the creative sparks needed for a true, globally recognized scientific revolution on par with its rival.
Exactly. And Japan's continued success, like these 2025 Nobels, just serves to highlight the depth of that systemic contradiction for Beijing. It probably increases the internal pressure, the frustration, and the complexity of their relationship even further.
Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the really fascinating context surrounding the 2025 Nobel Prizes. We hope this gave you, our listeners, a clearer view of some of the powerful forces, historical, political, and institutional, that are shaping scientific ambition and national identity in East Asia today.